Clara Whitfield pressed both hands flat against the snow and pushed herself upright, and that was when she saw it. The wagon tracks curving away down the mountain trail, already filling in, already disappearing. Her father's horses pulling the only home she had ever known, straight into the gray mouth of the storm without her. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood in the knee-deep snow at the edge of the tree line, with a small axe in her hand and the taste of pine sap on her lips, and she understood with a clarity that cut straight through the cold and the wind and the roaring of her own heart, that her family had not gotten lost. They had left her to die. If this story moves something in you, if you have ever been made to feel like too much, like not enough, like a burden someone had the right to set down and walk away from, then I need you to subscribe to this channel right now and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me. Now stay with me because what happens next will change the way you see everything. She had been gathering firewood for nearly 20 minutes before she admitted to herself that the silence behind her had lasted too long. Clara Whitfield was not a woman who moved quickly through the world. She understood that about herself the way she understood the weather, not with shame exactly, but with a certain tired practicality. Her body was large and solid, and had always required more effort than the world seemed willing to accommodate. Every steep trail cost her twice what it cost her stepsister. Every narrow passage required a breath and a decision. She had learned to plan ahead to conserve to read terrain, the way a river reads its banks, always looking for the gentlest way through. So when her stepmother Margaret had leaned out of the wagon that afternoon and called to her voice, honey-sweet and entirely false, Clara had not questioned it. "Clara, sweetheart, we need firewood before the storm gets worse. Just a bundle from the tree line. You're the strongest one here, you know that." She had taken the small axe her father kept strapped to the wagon's side panel. She had smiled at him, actually smiled because he was watching her, and she had spent 25 years learning to smile when what she wanted to do was something else entirely. Thomas Whitfield had not smiled back. He had looked somewhere past her left shoulder at the wall of gray cloud pressing down over the ridge and said nothing. She had walked into the trees. She told herself later that she should have felt it. Some deep body knowing, some animal warning in the pit of her stomach. But the truth was, she had been too busy watching her own footing in the snow to watch the space she was leaving behind. The drifts came up past her knees in places, and every step required her full attention, the placement of her boot, the test of the ice beneath the lean and the push and the recovery. This was the ordinary physics of being Clara in the wilderness, and she was used to it. She found a deadfall about 40 feet into the trees and began working at the dry branches, pulling them free from the snow, stacking them against her hip. The cold had gone sharp enough to hurt her ears. The wind picked up and threw loose powder off the pine boughs in long white streamers. She worked faster. The bundle grew heavy. Her arms ached. She thought about the fire her father would build, and the rabbit stew Margaret had promised, and the way the inside of the wagon smelled like wood smoke and tallow candles, and the particular mustiness of woolen blankets that had been packed and unpacked 100 times across 100 miles. She thought about the new settlement waiting at the end of this road. Cedar Falls, they called it. A proper town, Margaret had said, with a dry goods store and a church and people who didn't know their history. A fresh start, Margaret had said with the kind of bright, deliberate smile that always made Clara feel like she was being managed. She had wanted to believe it. She always wanted to believe things. That was the particular cruelty of being Clara Whitfield. Not that the world had been unkind to her, though it had relentlessly since the fever took her mother and left her alone with a father who loved her, but lacked the spine to protect her. The cruelty was that she kept believing anyway. Every fresh dismissal, every turned back, every whispered comment about her size that she wasn't supposed to hear but always did. None of it had managed to kill the part of her that still looked for kindness in people's eyes. Even Margaret's eyes sometimes, even now. She shifted the bundle of wood higher against her hip and turned back toward the trail. The tracks she had made going in were still visible, pressed deep and unmistakable into the snow. She followed them out through the tree line and stopped. The wagon was gone. Not gone like it had moved a little further up the trail to find better ground. Gone like the trail was empty in both directions for as far as she could see through the falling snow. Clara stood there for a moment, with the firewood against her hip and the small axe loose in her other hand, and simply looked at the place where her family had been. She noticed with the strange calm that sometimes comes in the moment before panic that the snow had been disturbed where the horses had stood. She could see the scrape of hooves, the packed ruts of wagon wheels turning in a deliberate arc. They had not been pushed forward by the storm. They had not been spooked and bolted. The turn was too controlled for that, too intentional. They had turned the wagon around and driven back the way they came. "Papa?" she said out loud to nobody. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. It disappeared immediately into the wind. She put the firewood down in the snow. She did not know why she did that. Some reflex. Maybe the impulse to set down a burden when you needed both hands free for something more important. She kept the axe. She walked to the center of the trail and looked in the direction the tracks led. They went back east down the grade they had spent the better part of that morning climbing. She looked west up toward the pass they had been trying to reach before the storm closed it. Nothing. Just snow and rock and the darkening sky. She understood it then. Not piece by piece the way understanding usually comes, but all at once like a hand slamming flat on a table. This had not been an accident. The firewood errand. The deliberate timing just as the storm was closing in. The fact that Margaret had made sure Clara carried the axe, which meant Clara had been the one to unbuckle it from the wagon panel, which meant she had touched it last, which meant nobody could say they had forgotten to give her something. Margaret had thought of everything, and her father had let her. Clara stood in the trail for a long time, with the wind driving snow against the back of her neck, and she did not cry. She noticed that about herself, with a kind of distant curiosity. She thought she would cry. She had cried at much smaller things. A cruel comment at a church social. Her stepsister's look of theatrical disgust when Clara sat down at the supper table the time a boy in the last town they'd passed through had made a sound like a pig snorting as she walked by, and then laughed when she flinched. All of those things had made her cry. This did not. This had gone somewhere deeper than tears, somewhere that didn't have a name yet. She looked at the axe in her hand. She looked at the wall of storm coming down over the ridge. She looked at her own footprints leading back into the trees where there was at least some shelter. At least the deadfall she had already identified, at least the wood she would need if she was going to have any chance at all. Then she walked back into the forest and picked up the firewood she had set down. She did not know how to survive a night alone in the Rocky Mountains in January. She knew how to cook over a campfire. She knew roughly how to find north by the stars, though the sky was already gone behind cloud. She knew that wet cold was more dangerous than dry cold, and that the most important thing was to stay dry and to keep moving, and that if you stopped moving for too long, your body stopped fighting. Her father had told her those things when she was a child before Margaret, back when he used to talk to her. She thought about him now. Thomas Whitfield, thin-shouldered and soft-spoken, with kind eyes that had gone increasingly distant over the last 3 years. She tried to find anger and kept finding something sadder instead. He had not been a cruel man when she was small. He had called her his little boulder, not unkindly because of her stubbornness. He said her tendency to just sit down in the middle of a situation and refuse to be moved by it. He had meant it as a compliment. She wondered when he had started seeing her the way Margaret did. She wondered if it mattered now. She built herself a shelter the way she'd heard her father describe. Once branches leaned together against the trunk of a fallen pine, the gaps packed with snow that had compacted enough to hold its shape. It was crude, and it was cold, and it was better than standing in the open. She made a small fire using the driest of the deadfall she'd gathered, and the steel striker she kept in the pocket of her coat. She had put it there herself months ago, a habit she'd developed after a scare on the Missouri crossing, where she'd gotten separated from the group briefly, and had felt for the first time the particular weight of being a person the world would not go out of its way to find. She had started carrying a few things after that. The striker, a folding knife, a folded piece of oilcloth she could use to keep her matches dry. Margaret had noticed once and said it was morbid. Had said it was the kind of thing a person did when they didn't trust God. Clara had kept doing it anyway. She sat by the small fire that night and ate the last of the dried cornbread she'd had in her coat pocket since morning, and she listened to the storm tear through the pine tops overhead, and she thought with remarkable clarity about the shape of her situation. She had no food beyond what she'd eaten. She had a fire that would need constant feeding. She had her coat, her boots, 2 pairs of woolen stockings, a shawl, and the clothes she was wearing. She had the axe, the knife, the striker. She did not have a compass or a map or any specific knowledge of where the nearest settlement was beyond Margaret's general declarations that Cedar Falls was 2 days west by wagon road. 2 days by wagon. On foot in this snow, in this cold by herself, she genuinely did not know. What she knew was that sitting still was not a plan. She did not sleep much that first night. Every time the fire burned low, she added more wood, and she listened to the sounds the mountain made in the dark, and she thought about the fact that out here alone and without help, her size was not the thing that would determine whether she lived or died. The mountain did not care what she looked like. The cold did not care. The storm tearing through overhead did not measure her by Margaret's standards or the standards of anyone who had ever looked at her body and made a judgment before she'd spoken a single word. The mountain only cared whether she kept moving. She could do that. By the second morning, the storm had blown itself out, and the world was white and silent and blindingly bright where the sun came through the trees. Her fire had lasted through the night. Her hands were stiff but functional. Her feet were cold, but she could feel them, which was what mattered. She ate snow for water. She found what she thought might be the frozen track of the wagon road under the drifts. She couldn't be certain. But the ground had a flatness to it that felt deliberate. The way roads always have a certain human logic to their level that distinguishes them from natural terrain. She went west, because that was where Cedar Falls was supposed to be, and because going east meant following her father's tracks. And she found with some surprise that she had no interest in doing that. She walked. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Not because of the cold, though the cold was serious. Not because of the depth of the snow, though it pulled at her with every step and burned through her stockings in the places where the drifts went above her boot tops. The hardest part was the silence. The absolute animal loneliness of moving through a world that had no edges she could see, with no sound, except the crunch of her own footsteps and the occasional percussion of snow sliding off a loaded branch somewhere in the trees. She talked to herself sometimes. Not crazy talk, just the kind of low, steady narration that keeps a person tethered to themselves. She said things like, "All right, Clara, this is the next 10 steps, count them out." She said things like, "You know what, this snow isn't any worse than that crossing in Nebraska, and you did that just fine." She said things like, "Keep your eyes open, there might be game trails. Game trails mean there's something living here, and something living means there's something to eat." She did not say, "My father chose his wife over his daughter." She did not say, "I am going to die out here, and nobody will come looking." She did not say, "I have been left behind by every single person who was supposed to choose me." She did not say those things out loud. But she thought them. She thought them with the part of herself that had gone quiet the moment she saw the empty trail, the part that had bypassed grief and gone straight to something colder and more durable. It felt a lot. She thought like the mountain, like being made of something that did not require anyone else's opinion in order to hold its own weight. By the second afternoon, her legs were shaking with every step, and she had long since stopped registering the cold as cold and had started registering it simply as a general condition of existence like gravity. She had found nothing she recognized as a road. She had seen rabbit tracks, but no rabbits. She had drunk snow until she thought she'd make herself sick with it and pressed on. She was in the process of forcing herself up a slope that seemed to have no top, both hands grabbing at pine branches to pull herself upward when her right boot broke through a crust of ice over a hidden hollow, and she went down hard on her side, the axe flying from her hand, and she lay there in the snow for a moment and thought with great clarity and no drama at all, "I cannot get up." Her legs were done. Her arms were trembling. The cold had eaten through the last of the warmth she had generated by moving, and she was now simply a large cold thing lying in the snow on a mountain in Colorado in January, and the sky above the trees was going gray again, and she did not have another night's worth of firewood. She pressed her hands into the snow. She pushed. She got one knee under her. "That's one," she said out loud to nobody. She found the other knee. "That's two." She was almost upright when she heard a sound that was not wind, and not a branch, and not anything the mountain made on its own. A low, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow. Purposeful footsteps spaced the way human footsteps are spaced, moving toward her through the trees. She had the knife out and open before she'd made a conscious decision to reach for it. She turned toward the sound, still half crouched with her back to the slope she'd been trying to climb. A man came out of the trees. He was a very large man, tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat made of something dark and heavy that Clara didn't immediately recognize as any single animal she knew. He had a rifle on his back, and an axe, a real one double-bladed, hanging from his belt, and a dog at his heel that was big enough to be a wolf, and silent enough to have been standing there for some time before Clara noticed it. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her in the direct, unhurried way of a person who had spent a great deal of time in places where there was nothing to pretend about. She held the knife where he could see it. "I can see that," he said. His voice was low and dry as a riverbed in August. "You planning to use it?" "I don't know yet," Clara said. "Depends on what you want." He looked at the knife. He looked at her face. He looked at the slope behind her and the fallen hollow where her boot had broken through, and the long drag marks in the snow where she'd gone down. "What I want," he said, "is to know how long you've been out here." 2 days. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she had seen enough pity to recognize it, and this was not that. It was more like a kind of serious reckoning. The look a person gets when they are revising the scale of a problem upward. "Alone," he said. She thought about her father's wagon tracks disappearing east. "Yes," she said. "Alone." He reached up slowly and pulled his hat down a fraction, not quite a tip, but something in that direction, an acknowledgement of some kind deliberate and oddly formal out here in the middle of the wilderness. "Name's Ethan Callahan," he said. "I've got a cabin about 40 minutes north of here. Fire's burning. You can put that knife away." Clara did not put the knife away. "Why?" she said. He looked at her again with that same level, unreading steadiness. "Because you're alive," he said. "And I'd like you to stay that way. That's the whole of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the dog who had sat down in the snow and was watching her with amber eyes that were entirely calm. She looked at the sky going gray above the trees and felt the temperature dropping with the light. She thought about what another night out here would cost her. She folded the knife and put it in her pocket. She kept her hand on it. "All right, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Lead the way." He nodded once the way a man nods when the terms of something have been settled, and he turned north without saying anything else, and the dog rose silently and fell into step beside him. And Clara Whitfield, who had been left to die in the snow by the only family she had ever known, pulled herself fully upright, squared her shoulders against the cold, and followed a stranger into the dark trees. She did not know his reasons. She did not know his history. She did not know what waited at the end of 40 minutes of walking through the dark and the cold and the gathering storm. But she was still moving. And on this mountain, in this January, in this particular winter of her life, that was the only thing that mattered. The 40 minutes Ethan had promised turned out to be closer to an hour, and Clara did not complain about that because complaining would have required breath she did not have. She followed him through the dark and the cold, with her hand still on the knife in her pocket, and her eyes on the back of his coat, and she counted her steps the way she had been doing since morning, not because the numbers meant anything, but because counting gave her mind something to hold on to besides the fear. The dog walked between them, occasionally dropping back to check on her with those amber eyes, and she found to her own surprise that she was grateful for the animal. It gave her something to watch that was not the back of a stranger's head. Ethan Callahan did not speak during that walk. He did not look back to check on her more than twice, and both times he did it quickly and without expression, the way a man checks on a supply he is transporting rather than a person he is curious about. She did not take offense at that. She had spent enough of her life being looked at with too much expression, the particular loaded gaze people used when they saw her body, before they saw her face, and the neutrality of this man's attention was in its own strange way a relief. She was breathing in short, hard pulls by the time she smelled wood smoke. Then there was a light through the trees, orange and low, and absolutely the most beautiful thing she had seen in 2 days, and she almost stopped walking just to look at it. "Door's not locked," Ethan said without turning around. She went in ahead of him. The heat hit her like something physical. She stood just inside the door and felt her body begin to shake, not from cold, or not only from cold, but from the particular violence of warmth reaching tissue that had gone too far in the other direction for too long. Her hands trembled. Her knees went uncertain. She pressed one hand against the wall to steady herself and focused on breathing. The dog pushed past her and went to a spot by the fire and turned 3 times and lay down with the absolute authority of an animal that knew exactly where it belonged. She envied that. Ethan came in behind her and shut the door and crossed the room and added 2 logs to the fire without looking at her. He hung his coat on a peg near the door. He set the big axe against the wall with a care that said it was something he respected. Then he turned and looked at her properly in the full light of the fire for the first time. She waited for it. The thing people's faces did when they looked at her, the small adjustment, the recalibration, the moment when whoever she was talking to finished revising their opinion downward. She had seen it so many times that she had developed a reflex for it, a way of setting her jaw and going slightly still, that said, "I see you seeing me, and I am not going to make it easier for you." Ethan Callahan's face did not do the thing. He looked at her the way he had looked at the slope where she'd fallen and at the sky going gray above the trees, with a practical assessing attention that was entirely about the situation and not about his feelings regarding it. "Your feet," he said. "Cold," she admitted. "Sit down and get those boots off. Frostbite starts at the extremities." "I know how frostbite works." "Then you know why I said sit down." She sat down. It was not a graceful process. There was a low stool near the fire, and she misjudged the height of it and came down harder than she meant to, and for a half-second she braced herself for the look, the sound some acknowledgement of the indignity of it. None came. Ethan was already at the far end of the room doing something at a shelf, and when he came back he had a rough wool blanket and a tin basin. "Can you get the boots off yourself?" he asked. "Yes," she said with more certainty than she felt. She got the boots off herself. It took a while, and her fingers were clumsy with cold, but she managed it, and she peeled off the outer stockings, which were wet through, and looked at her feet. They were very pale. She could feel them now, a deep bone ache that was, she understood, a better sign than not feeling them at all. She pressed one finger into the pad of her big toe, and the color returned slowly. "Not frostbitten," Ethan said, looking over her shoulder. "I told you I know how it works." He almost smiled. She caught the very edge of it before his expression settled back to neutral. He put the basin on the floor in front of her and poured water into it from a pot he'd had warming near the fire. Not hot, barely warm, the correct temperature for feet that had been seriously cold, and she put her feet in without being told to. "You got a name?" he said. He sat down on a chair across the fire from her, far enough to be respectful, close enough that she could see his face clearly. "Clara Whitfield." "Where were you coming from, Clara Whitfield?" "East. We were coming from Missouri. My family was headed to Cedar Falls." "Were," he said. He caught the tense. He was sharp, she noted. Sharp in the way that people who live alone often get, not book-learned, but observant in the specific way of someone who has spent years reading the world directly rather than through other people's interpretations of it. "Were," she confirmed. She did not offer more than that. He looked at her for a moment. "Wagon," he said. "Yes." "Storm come up fast." She understood what he was asking. He was giving her an out, a version of events in which her family had been separated from her by accident and circumstance rather than intention. He was being kind about it, which somehow made it worse. "The storm came up," she said carefully, "while I was gathering firewood. I walked back out of the trees and the wagon was gone. The tracks showed a deliberate turn. They went east." She paused. "I did not follow them." There was a silence. In it, the fire cracked and Ranger shifted in his sleep. "I see," Ethan said. 2 words, flat and simple and carrying. She felt a weight of understanding that a longer response would have diluted. He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask why. He did not make any of the faces people made when they encountered a story too ugly for social comfort. The pity face, the horror face, the face that said, "I am grateful. I am not you." He just said, "I see," and let it be what it was. "How long you been out there?" he said. 2 days. I built a shelter the first night. Used what I had." "Fire." "Yes, small, but it lasted." He looked at her hands, then at the redness across her knuckles, the cuts from handling rough branches, the dark edge of cold damage at the tips of 2 fingers on her right hand. "You did well," he said. She did not know what to do with that. She had been doing well. She knew that she had kept herself alive through 2 days on a mountain in January with next to nothing, and she was aware that that was not nothing. But hearing it said plainly without qualification, without the particular backhanded quality that compliments directed at her, had always seemed to carry. "You did well for someone like you. You managed surprisingly. I didn't expect it of you," hearing it said, just as a clean flat fact nearly undid her in a way the cold had not. She looked at the fire. "I was going to stop," she said, "on that slope, when I went down." She did not know why she was telling him this. "I couldn't get back up. My legs were gone. I thought—" She stopped. "But you got back up," he said. "Not all the way. You found me before I finished." "You had the knife out," he said. "I've come up on people in bad shape before. Most of them by that point they're done fighting. You weren't done." She thought about the knife. The reflex of it, the way her hand had moved before her mind had decided anything. Some part of her, some deep stubborn underneath part, had not yet agreed to stop. She thought for the first time since she'd walked out of that tree line and found the empty trail that this might actually be relevant information about herself. She slept that first night on a cot Ethan pulled out from a storage space against the far wall, under 2 wool blankets and a bearskin with the fire burning low, and Ranger's warm weight settled uninvited across her feet. She did not protest the dog. She was asleep within minutes, the deep, dreamless sleep of a body that has used everything it had and needs to go somewhere very quiet to find more. She woke to the smell of coffee and salt pork. Ethan was at the stove with his back to her. He had not yet heard her wake, or if he had, he gave no sign of it, just went on doing what he was doing with the particular self-contained concentration of a man who had spent years alone and was used to performing all the functions of a household without an audience. She watched him for a moment. He moved efficiently. No wasted motion, no performance of domesticity. He salted the pork with the same matter-of-fact economy he'd used to add wood to the fire the night before, like a man who had made peace a long time ago with the fact that life consisted mostly of small, practical acts performed in sequence. "You don't have to cook for me," she said. He turned around. He had the same expression she was beginning to understand was simply his face. Level, attentive, not unfriendly. "I was cooking anyway," he said. "Sit up slowly. You'll be stiff." She was stiff. Extraordinarily stiff in the specific way that comes after a body has been pushed to its actual physical limit and then slept hard, like all the joints had been taken apart and reassembled in slightly the wrong order. She got herself upright by degrees, and Ethan set a tin cup of coffee on the low table near the cot, without being asked, and went back to the stove. She drank the coffee. It was very strong and slightly bitter, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. "What do you do out here?" she said after a while. "Trap." "Some." Hunt. Trade pelts in town when the passes are open. Keep the place running. He turned the salt pork in the pan. What do you do? It took her a second to understand the question. Not what are you not? What is your situation? But what do you do, present tense? Like she was a person with skills that continued to exist independent of her circumstances. I cook, she said. I'm good at it. I can make something out of almost nothing. I sew. I keep accounts. I helped my father with his books for years before. She paused. I'm practical. That's what I am. I'm very practical. I noticed, he said. Most people I've found in the shape you were in, they've eaten their food the first day and burned themselves down trying to keep a fire going all night. You rationed. You could tell that from my condition. I could tell that from the fact that you were still functional. Barely, but functional. He slid the salt pork onto a tin plate and brought it to her. Eat. She ate. She had not known she was hungry until the food was in front of her, and then she was suddenly and entirely hungry in every cell of her body. She ate with the focused unself-consciousness of a person who has passed the point where social performance matters, and Ethan sat across from her with his own plate, and did not seem to notice or care, and that absence of noticing she thought was itself a kind of gift. They were halfway through the meal when he said, "There's a settlement called Harrow Creek, about 4 days south on foot less when the trails are clear. Come spring I can take you." He said it the way he said most things plainly without preface. You can stay here until the passes open. Clara set down her fork. I don't want charity, she said. I know you don't. I'm not offering charity. I'm stating geography. He looked at her steadily. You can't go anywhere for at least 2 months. The mountain decides that, not me. You can sit here and feel like a burden if you want. Or you can be useful and we'll call it an arrangement. An arrangement, she repeated. I can use help. I won't pretend otherwise. Trapline needs tending in shifts. Food stores need organizing. I've been letting things go sloppy because there's only one of me and only so many hours. He picked up his coffee. You're capable. I can see that. You'd be doing work, not accepting charity. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. She was waiting for the condition. There was always a condition. In her experience, offers made to her came with something underneath them, something that would be revealed later, some payment expected that hadn't been mentioned at the front end of the agreement. She had learned to wait for it, the way you learned to wait for the second shoe. What do you want from me? She said, straight out. I told you what I want, he said. Help with the trapline, help with the stores, company at dinner maybe if you're willing. He paused. That's the whole of it, Clara. I'm not a complicated man. She looked at him. She looked at the room, the rough walls, the careful order of it despite the solitude the rifle cleaned and hung, and the tools arranged with a methodical respect that said something about the character of the person who lived here. She looked at Ranger, who had gotten up from the cot when she did, and now sat between them, like a moderator looking from one face to the other. All right, she said. An arrangement. The first week was careful and quiet. Clara had expected it to be awkward, two strangers in a small space, each taking measure of the other, managing the particular friction of coexistence with someone whose habits and rhythms you don't yet know. But Ethan Callahan's rhythms turned out to be easy to read, not because he explained them, but because he enacted them consistently. And consistency was something Clara had always been good at working with. He rose before dawn. He was quiet about it. She heard him, but he was not careless. He had coffee ready before he left to check the lines, and he left it where she would find it, which was a small thing, and told her a great deal. He came back mid-morning. He worked in the afternoon. He was done by dark, and in the evenings he sat near the fire and did maintenance work, mending, sharpening the endless small repairs that kept a wilderness life functional, and he did not require conversation, but he did not refuse it either. On the third night, she asked him how long he'd been out here. He was sharpening a knife, running it across the whetstone in slow, even strokes, and he didn't look up when he answered. 6 years, he said. Alone. A beat. Mostly. She let that sit. She had learned quickly that Ethan answered what was asked and nothing beyond it, and that the right response to a partial answer was not to push, but to wait. He would say more if he wanted to say more. He didn't say more that night, but 2 nights later, when she was mending a tear in the heavy canvas of a supply pack, and he was across the fire from her, he said, without looking up from the trap mechanism he was cleaning, "I had a wife, Sarah, and a boy, James." He paused, a clean, deliberate pause that had thinking in it. Fever took them. Summer of '72. She looked at him. He was still looking at the trap. "I'm sorry," she said. "So was I." He turned the mechanism over in his hands. "Still am some days. Less than before." He looked up then and met her eyes briefly and directly. "I came out here because I couldn't be around people after. Couldn't stand the way they looked at me. Like I was glass. Like I might—" He stopped, set the trap down, picked up his coffee. "I don't need that anymore. The looking, I just never went back." Clara thought about people looking at her. About the kind of looking she had lived with, the assessment, the judgment, the reduction of her to a collection of visible qualities and their assumed deficiencies. She thought about how different his kind of looking was from hers, and how underneath the difference, the experience was remarkably similar, being looked at in a way that made you smaller, being made into a thing that could be read at a glance. "I understand that," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up the trap again. That was the night something shifted, not dramatically. There were no declarations, no revelations, nothing that would have announced itself as significant to an observer. Just 2 people on either side of a fire doing quiet work, and the particular quality of the silence between them changing, losing some of its carefulness, gaining something that was closer to ease. Clara started helping with the trap line in the 2nd week. Ethan had not suggested it, she had asked, and he had looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as surprised, but not showing it, and had said, "Can you manage the footing? There are some icy stretches." "I managed 2 days alone on the mountain," she said. "Fair enough," he said. And that was that. The trapline work was hard. She came back from the first morning of it with her arms aching and her balance tested beyond anything she'd encountered before, and a nasty scrape on her left palm from a moment where she'd grabbed at a branch to keep herself upright, and the branch had been rougher than she expected. She did not mention any of this. She cleaned the scrape herself that afternoon and bandaged it with a strip of cloth from a piece of spare fabric she found in Ethan's repair supplies. When he noticed the bandage that evening, he looked at it and then looked at her. "Branch," she said. "Which stretch?" "The one by the 2nd stream crossing." He nodded. "There's a better line to take just to the left of the big deadfall. I should have shown you." "Show me tomorrow," she said. He showed her tomorrow. By the end of the 3rd week, she had learned the whole line, not just the path, but the logic of it. The reasoning behind the placement of each set the way Ethan thought about the terrain and the animal behavior in relation to each other. He explained these things. When she asked in the same plain, efficient way, he explained everything else, and she listened with the full attention she gave to anything she was trying to learn, and she retained it. And after a while, she noticed that he had stopped saying, "Go left at the deadfall," and started just walking, because he had learned that she remembered. "You pick things up fast," he said one morning on the line, checking a set near the creek. "I've always had to," she said. He looked at her. "My family wasn't—" She stopped, started again. "People made assumptions about me, about what I could manage, about what I was capable of. When you're told often enough that you're less than you are, you either believe it or you spend every day quietly proving it wrong." She checked the next set and reset it. "I chose to spend every day proving it wrong." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Who told you that you were less?" he said. "My stepmother, mostly. But she didn't start it. She just refined it, made it more efficient." Clara moved to the next set. "My father let her." That's the part I keep coming back to. He let her. Ethan reset the last trap on that stretch of line and straightened up, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. "A man who lets that happen," he said, "isn't worth following east." She looked at him. "No," she said, "he isn't." They stood there a moment in the cold, both of them looking at the frozen creek, and Clara felt something she had not felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it, the particular quiet of being with a person who saw you clearly and did not find what they saw wanting. It was the 4th week when Clara found the wooden box. She was reorganizing the supply shelves the way Ethan had reluctantly agreed she could, because the current system made her quietly insane every time she needed to find anything. And she found it on the highest shelf behind a folded blanket. A small box cedar with a brass latch, the kind that people kept letters in. She did not open it, but she left it where it was, and that evening she told Ethan she'd moved everything on the upper shelf except the box. He went very still. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "I didn't touch it." "I know." He looked at the shelf for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Those are Sarah's letters. She wrote she liked to write things down. After she died, I couldn't—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I keep them. I don't read them anymore, but I keep them." Clara thought about what it meant to hold on to something that hurt too much to look at, but that you couldn't let go of. She thought about the fact that she did not have a single object from her childhood. Not a letter, not a photograph, not even the little wooden button her mother had given her before she died, because Margaret had cleaned out Clara's belongings once, during a trip, and thrown out what she called clutter. "She sounds like she was someone worth keeping," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "She was," he said, and then quietly, "she would have liked you." Clara did not know what to do with that either, so she just looked at the fire and nodded, and they sat in the particular silence that falls between two people who have said something true and are both deciding what to do with the truth. But it was not the box that broke things open. It was a Thursday 5 weeks in, when Ethan came in from the line, looking wrong too pale under the cold, his jaw set differently, holding his left arm at an angle that was not natural. "What happened?" Clara said. Not a question. She was already up from the table. "Trap recoiled," he said. "Reset wrong. I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't." She made him sit down. She made him take the coat off, which cost him more than he wanted to show. The arm was not broken. She ran her hands along it, the way her father had taught her to check for fractures back when she was young, and he still taught her things, but the muscle along his forearm had taken a serious impact, and the bruising was already coming up dark and promising to get worse. "You need to rest this for at least 2 days," she said. "The line needs to be checked." "I'll check the line." He looked at her. "I know the whole line," she said. "You taught me the whole line. I know every set, I know the terrain, I know the backup routes. I'll take Ranger." She met his eyes steadily. "You sat with me through 2 days of recovery without once making me feel like a problem. Let me do the same for you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, complicated and layered and not fully readable, the look of a man encountering something he had not prepared himself for. "Clara," he said and stopped. 2 days, she said. "Rest the arm. I'll handle the line." He said in a voice that was lower than usual and very precise, "I have not let anyone handle anything for me in 6 years." "I know," she said, "but I'm not anyone." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing in the room. Ranger looked from Ethan to Clara and then lay down across both their feet with the serene confidence of an animal that had already decided how this was going to go. Ethan looked at the dog. He looked at Clara. He looked at his arm. 2 days, he said. 2 days. She agreed. She checked the line both mornings. She reset 3 sets that needed it. She came back both evenings with pelts, and with the specific quiet satisfaction of work done right, and she cooked, and she made sure the coffee was hot, and she did not once make him feel like a problem. On the second evening, he said without looking up from the careful work of doing absolutely nothing with his injured arm, "I was wrong about what I thought this was going to be." "What did you think it was going to be?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "A responsibility," he said. Someone to get through the winter and deliver to the next town. Something to manage. He looked at the fire. I was wrong about that. Clara looked at her hands. People have been wrong about me my whole life, she said. They see what I look like, and they decide what I am. They decide what I can carry and what I can't, what I'm worth. She paused. You were the first person in a long time who just watched and revised. You made it easy to revise, he said. She looked at him. He was looking back, and for the first time since she'd pulled out that knife in the snow and tried to decide whether he was something to be afraid of, she could see something in his face that was fully present and unguarded and directed entirely at her. Not at her body, not at her size, not at her circumstances or her history or the particular complicated weight of everything she carried with her. At her. She looked away first. She looked at the fire. But she was smiling when she did it just slightly, in the way of a person who has been surprised by something they thought the world had run out of. And outside the mountain, winter went on, doing what it had always done, cold and enormous and indifferent to human arrangements. While inside the cabin, very quietly, something that had been impossible 3 weeks ago became simply true. The smiling didn't stop. That was the thing Clara noticed first about the days that followed. Not that something dramatic had changed. Not that Ethan suddenly became a different man, but that she kept catching herself smiling at small things. The way he set her coffee down without being asked. The way Ranger had completely abandoned any pretense of neutrality and now slept exclusively across her feet. The way Ethan, when he was concentrating hard on something, made a barely audible sound in the back of his throat that was almost a hum and almost a growl, and was entirely unconscious. She noticed these things the way you notice a wound closing not all at once, but in the daily checking the small reliable evidence of something that was getting better. His arm healed in 3 days, not 2. She did not say anything about that. He came with her on the 4th day to check the line, and she showed him the 3 sets she had repositioned because the original placement wasn't catching, and she had worked out why. He looked at her adjustments for a long moment without speaking. That's better than what I had, he said finally. The deer are coming from the north this week, she said. Wind shifted. They're using different cover. He looked at her. How'd you know that? Ranger, she said. Watch the way his head tracks in the morning when he goes out. He's been facing north-northeast for 4 days. Ethan looked at the dog. Then he looked back at her with that expression she had cataloged by now, the one that landed somewhere between surprised and something warmer that he hadn't yet decided to name. I've had that dog for 5 years, he said. And I never noticed that. She shrugged. You weren't looking for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reset the line the way she'd shown him, and they went on, and that was all that was said about it, but she felt the weight of it walking beside her. The rest of that morning, the particular satisfaction of being seen to know something, seen to be competent and sharp, by someone who had not expected it, and was not pretending he had. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. The days that followed had a rhythm to them now, an ease that was different from the careful coexistence of the first weeks. They worked the line together in the mornings. She managed the cooking and the supply organization and the repair work that had been accumulating in Ethan's careful but limited domestic attention. He cut wood, managed the heavier maintenance kept them in fuel and water. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked or didn't talk, and both the talking and the not talking had become comfortable. She learned things about him in pieces. He had grown up in Kentucky. His father had been a blacksmith, and he had worked the forge from the time he was 11, which explained the particular density of his arms and the way he handled tools with a precision that came from years of work where imprecision had consequences. He had come west at 22 with nothing but ambition and the naive conviction that the frontier rewarded boldness. It had rewarded him in some ways and devastated him in others, and the version of himself he had become. Out here on this mountain was the result of being rebuilt from the pieces the frontier had left. He learned things about her in pieces too. He learned that she could calculate supply ratios in her head faster than most men could on paper. He learned that she had a precise and deadpan humor that emerged when she was comfortable, the kind of dry wit that only appeared in people who had spent years making peace with difficult situations. He learned that she talked to Ranger when she thought no one was listening, full conversations conducted in the same calm tone she used for everything, as if the dog's end of the exchange was simply implied. He heard her once coming in quietly from the wood store and stood outside the door for a moment, listening to her explain to the dog, in patient detail, why the current system for storing dried beans was an insult to organizational logic. He was smiling when he came inside. She looked up and saw the real version, not the quarter smile she'd caught glimpses of before, but the full one which rearranged his face entirely and made him look younger and warmer, and like someone she wished she had known before the mountain had finished the process of closing him down. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and went to hang up his coat. But he was still smiling. She looked at Ranger, who looked back at her with the serenity of an animal that had accomplished exactly what it intended. But it was in the 6th week that everything shifted. Clara was alone in the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon when she heard horses. Not one horse. Multiple horses moving at a pace that was deliberate and not hurried, the way riders move when they know where they're going and have been before. She heard them before she could place the sound, registered it as something that did not belong in the ordinary catalog of mountain sounds, and her hand was on the knife before she reached the door. She opened it. 3 men on horseback stopped about 20 yards from the cabin. 2 of them she did not know. Rough-looking men, the kind who worked for other people, and had made a professional practice of not thinking too hard about what the work involved. The 3rd man she recognized immediately, with a jolt that went through her entire body like cold water. It was Gerald Pratt. She knew Gerald Pratt from the last town they had passed through on their journey west, a land broker with sharp eyes and a soft handshake, the kind of man who had the specific gift of making a transaction feel like a favor. He had spoken to her father at length at their last supply stop, and Clara had not trusted him. Then had felt something low and animal in her stomach when he smiled, the particular wrongness of a man who is always calculating whether you're useful to him. He was calculating now. She watched him do it, watched his eyes move from her to the cabin, to the pelts drying on the rack, and back to her, and she kept her hand on the knife, and her face very still. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with the practiced ease of a man who had made courtesy into a tool. "Didn't expect to find company up here. This Callahan's place." "Who's asking?" she said. Something flickered across his face. She had not answered the way he expected. She had not been flustered or deferential or moved by the hat tip, and he was adjusting. "Name's Pratt, Gerald Pratt. I have some business with Mr. Callahan regarding this land." "What kind of business?" "Land business, ma'am." He smiled. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "When do you expect him back?" "I don't," she said. "You can state your business with me, or you can ride back the way you came. Those are the options." There was a silence. One of the other riders shifted in his saddle. Pratt kept smiling. "Well now," he said softly, "I think I'll wait for Mr. Callahan if it's all the same." "It isn't all the same," she said. "You're not welcome to wait." She held the door and looked at him, and she did not move, and after a long moment Pratt touched his hat again, a different touch this time, sharper with something underneath it, and turned his horse around. "We'll be back," he said pleasantly. They rode out the way they came. Clara stood in the doorway until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then she went inside and sat down and noticed her hands were shaking, not from fear, or not primarily from fear, but from the particular adrenaline of a confrontation that was not over, just deferred. She was still sitting there, working through what she'd seen and what it meant when Ethan came in an hour later. He read her immediately. He had gotten very good at that. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. The 3 horses, the 2 riders, she didn't know, Gerald Pratt and his smooth manner and his land business, and the way his eyes had moved over the cabin, like he was already calculating its value. Ethan's face did something complicated while she talked. By the time she was done, it had settled into something flat and very controlled. You know him, she said. I know of him. He sat down heavily. He's been working this part of the territory for 2 years, filing land claims on property that already has occupants, then using lawyers and technicalities to push the occupants out. He's done it to 4 families that I know of. He was quiet for a moment. There's a question about my claim. The original filing was done by a man named Patterson, who I bought this land from, and there's some argument that Patterson didn't have clear title when he sold it. Is that true? I don't know. Patterson told me it was clear. I paid him a fair price. I've been here 6 years, and I've never had a challenge to it until about 2 months ago when I started hearing from other settlers that Pratt was asking questions about this parcel. He looked at his hands. I don't have the original documents. They were lost in the flood of '74. Clara felt the shape of the problem settle over her like something physical. He's going to file a competing claim, she said. Most likely. Can he win it? Ethan was quiet for too long. I don't know, he said. Without the documents, I can't prove what I paid and to whom. Pratt will have lawyers. I have... He stopped. 6 years of being out here, which doesn't mean anything to a court, Clara thought. She thought the way she thought through supply logistics and trapline calculations methodically without letting the emotional weight of the problem interfere with the actual analysis of it. What do you know about Patterson's original deed? She said. It was filed in Denver, Hall of Records, spring of '71. Then the record exists, she said. Even if your copy is gone, the filed record is still there. He looked at her. Denver is 4 days south, he said. In February. I know, but the record exists, which means Pratt can't claim there's no proof. He just knows your proof is gone and is counting on you not having the resources to get the official record. She leaned forward. Do you have anyone in Denver? Anyone who could make a filing request on your behalf? Ethan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. There's a man named Holt, he said slowly. Judge's clerk. I did him a service 4 years ago. He owes me. Write him a letter, Clara said. Tonight. Explain what you need. Get it to the nearest relay station before Pratt makes his filing, or at least concurrent with it, so there's a competing document in the queue. She paused. Also, Pratt said land business. If he's been working this territory for 2 years and doing what you say he does, other settlers know him. Other settlers have grievances. Have you talked to any of them? Not recently. He stopped. I don't talk to people much. I know, she said. But if there are 4 families who've been displaced by this man, there are 4 families who'd want to see him answered for it. Testimony from affected parties carries weight even in a corrupt court. Ethan stared at her. She realized belatedly that she had been talking very fast and very directly, and with considerable authority, on a subject that had not previously been established as her area of expertise, and she paused. I used to help my father with disputes, she said more quietly. Small ones, nothing like this. But I know how paper and testimony work together. I know how men like Pratt operate. They bank on people being too scattered and too overwhelmed to organize a real defense. There was a silence. Clara, Ethan said. You don't have to take my advice, she said. I'm telling you what I see. I know you are. He looked at her steadily. I was going to say thank you. She stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked briefly like a man deciding something. I've been letting this sit, he said, because I didn't know what to do, and I didn't have anyone to think it through with. 6 years of handling everything alone, you stop believing there's another way to do it. He paused. You make it look easy, having someone to think with. It's not easy, she said. You just haven't had it in a while. He was quiet. No, he said. I haven't. They wrote the letter to Holt that night, Ethan drafting Clara, refining both of them, working through the language, until it was precise and urgent without being panicked. She had a way with words on paper that surprised him, a clean directness that cut to the heart of things, without waste. He told her so, and she said she had learned it from writing letters for her father that he would then rewrite to make longer and more meandering. And she had spent years marveling at how people consistently confused length with authority. He laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and it startled both of them. Not the laugh itself, but the ease of it, the way it arrived without announcement. She got the letter sealed and addressed before the fire burned low. But 2 days later, Pratt came back. This time, he came with 4 riders and a man Clara didn't recognize, who carried a leather satchel and had the look of someone paid to wear good clothes in bad places. A lawyer, or close enough. Ethan was there this time. He came out of the cabin ahead of Clara and stood with the particular stillness of a man who had decided already how he was going to be in this situation. Pratt looked from Ethan to Clara and back to Ethan with a smile that was doing a great deal of work. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "Good to finally meet you. I was attended to last time by your—" a pause, a deliberate pause. "Housekeeper." "She's not my housekeeper," Ethan said. Something moved across Pratt's face. He filed that information away, the way he filed all information quickly and for future use. "My mistake," he said. "I've come to discuss the matter of this land parcel. I represent a claim filed by the Denver Land Trust under territorial charter." "I know what you represent," Ethan said. "And I've already corresponded with the Hall of Records in Denver regarding my original deed. You'll find there's a filed record of legitimate sale." He did not look at Clara. He said it flat and calm and absolute. "If your client believes there's a competing claim, he can make it through the court. I'll see him there." Pratt's smile had gone thinner. "The court," he said, "may not look favorably on a claim without documentation." "The court will have documentation," Clara said. Pratt looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time, not the dismissive assessment of their first meeting, but the look of a man recalibrating. Taking her seriously in a way he had not the first time, because this time she was standing beside Ethan and speaking with the flat authority of someone who knew what she knew. "You seem very confident, ma'am," he said pleasantly. "I am," she said. "I've also taken the liberty of writing to Mr. Henry Aldis of the Territorial Surveyor's Office regarding the pattern of claims your organization has filed in this county over the past 2 years. Mr. Aldis is an old acquaintance of my father's." This was a large construction of the truth. Henry Aldis was a name she had found in a 3-year-old newspaper in Ethan's supply pile, and she had no idea whether he still held that position, but Pratt did not know that. "I understand he takes a particular interest in patterns that suggest coordinated fraud." The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence. One of the riders shifted his horse. The lawyer in the good clothes looked sideways at Pratt. Pratt looked at Clara for a long moment. His smile did not drop. But it changed in a way that was very specific. It became the smile of a man who has been playing a game and has just discovered the other side has been playing it too. "Well," he said, "we'll see how this unfolds." He turned his horse. They rode out the same way they'd come in, and Clara watched until the sound was gone before she let out the breath she had been managing for the past 4 minutes. "Henry Aldis," Ethan said from beside her. "I found the name in an old paper," she said. "I don't know if it worked." "It worked," he said. "You made him uncertain. A man like Pratt depends on certainty, the certainty that his target is alone and doesn't know how to fight back. You just told him that you know how to fight back." "We don't actually know how to fight back," she said. "Not fully. The letter to Holt might not—" "Clara." He turned to look at her. "We have more than we had this morning. That's enough for right now." She looked at him. "We," he had said. "Not you, not I. We." She turned back toward the cabin and walked inside, and she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and felt the shaking work its way through her and out the way it always did when the adrenaline had finished with her. Ethan came in and put a cup of coffee on the table in front of her without being asked. He sat down across from her. "I need to tell you something," he said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard before, low and deliberate, in a way that was not about being calm. It was about being careful, about choosing words that had the right weight. She looked at him. "I have not cared," he said, "about the outcome of anything in a very long time." He was looking at his hands. "After Sarah and James, I kept the cabin running because survival has a logic that doesn't ask your permission. But actually caring how something turns out beyond just whether you wake up the next morning, I hadn't done that." He paused. "Until recently." Clara did not move. "I'm telling you this," he said, still looking at his hands, "because you faced down a man who has displaced 4 families with a name out of an old newspaper and nothing but nerve, and I watched you do it, and I—" He stopped. "I need you to know that I see what you are, not what your family decided you were, not what people have told you. What you actually are." She thought she was not going to cry. She had not cried since the trail, not in the first shock of it, not in the 2 days alone on the mountain, not in any of the weeks of careful reconstruction she'd done since. She had been managing her feelings with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything else. Something was not cooperating with that plan right now. "Ethan," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just needed to say it." She looked at the fire. She thought about her father's wagon disappearing into the snow, and the small axe in her hand, and the counting 1 step, 2 step, keep moving. She thought about the slope where her legs had given out, and the moment she had thought with perfect quiet clarity that she could not get up. She thought about the knife in her hand when Ethan had come out of the trees. She thought about all of it. And she thought about this room and this table and this man across from her who had lost everything that mattered to him and had rebuilt himself in solitude, and was now in his careful and unloquacious way telling her that something she had done had mattered to him. "I see you too," she said. He looked up. "What you were before," she said. "What the mountain made you into. What you're choosing now." She met his eyes directly. "I see all of it." Something in his face moved, deep and serious, and not something he had planned. Ranger chose this moment to get up from his spot by the fire and plant himself between them, putting his head on the table with the absolute solemnity of an animal making a formal point. Ethan looked at the dog. He looked at Clara. He breathed out through his nose, not quite a laugh, but close to it. "He does this," he said. "I've noticed," she said. "He seems to have decided you belong here." She scratched behind Ranger's ears. The dog's eyes went to half-mast with satisfaction. "Smart dog," she said, and across the fire, Ethan Callahan looked at the woman who had walked out of a snowstorm into his life with a knife in her hand and everything else she owned taken from her. And he understood, not for the first time, but with the particular depth of understanding that comes when you have stopped arguing with a truth, that the mountain had given him something he had not known to ask for. But the week was not done with them yet. 3 days after Pratt's second visit, the storm came. Not a normal mountain storm. A genuine front, the kind that dropped 4 feet of snow in 36 hours, and turned the whole world white and wall-less and without direction. Clara heard it building the night before the pressure change that she had learned to feel in her ears by now, the particular quality of the wind that meant something serious was coming. She told Ethan at dinner. "I know," he said. "I've been watching it since yesterday." "The supply shed," she said. "The far wall has a weak joint. I noticed it last week. If this hits as hard as it sounds like it's going to, I was going to brace it in the morning." "Do it tonight," she said. He looked at her. Then he got up and got his coat. They braced it together in the dark with the wind already starting to bite, and the first flakes coming sideways off the ridge. It was clumsy work in the growing dark and the growing cold, and they were both moving fast because the window for moving fast was closing with every gust. She held the bracing timber while he drove the stakes, and she could feel the wood trying to move in her hands, the storm pulling at it, testing it, and she set her weight against it and held. They got back inside 20 minutes before it became impossible to be outside. The storm hit the cabin like something with intention. The walls took it and held, which told Clara things about how Ethan had built this place that she filed away alongside everything else she had learned about him. The supply shed held too. They were in the cabin for 37 hours. This was not the comfortable, companionable evenings they had developed over 6 weeks. This was confinement close and loud, with the storm pressing on every wall, the fire needing feeding every few hours, the cabin moving in small ways that were structurally fine, but emotionally unsettling. Ranger paced for the first few hours, and then gave up and lay down, with his head under Clara's cot, like a dog who had filed a formal protest and was awaiting the outcome. They talked more in those 37 hours than in all the weeks before combined. Not about important things at first. They talked about practical things, the storm, the supplies, the question of whether the northeast corner of the roof was going to need attention after this passed. Then they talked about less practical things, his childhood in Kentucky, her mother, the particular quality of Missouri springs compared to Colorado winters, the books they had both read, and the ones they thought they would have liked if they'd had more access to books. Somewhere in the second day of it, he told her about the last day he had spent with James. He told it simply and directly, the way he told everything his son had been 6 years old and had been asking to see the river being a creek downstream that Ethan had told him was too cold and too fast in the spring floods for a small boy to get near. And Ethan had been busy. He had said, "Not today." And James had said, "Okay, Papa." And 3 weeks later, James was gone, and the creek was still there, and Ethan had gone and stood at the bank of it in October when the water was low and slow and perfectly safe, and he had stood there for a long time. He had never told that story to anyone. Clara could feel the weight of that, the specific gravity of a thing that has been carried alone for 6 years because there was no one to hand it to. She did not try to fix it. She did not say it was not his fault, though it wasn't because he knew that, and it hadn't mattered. She just said, "Tell me something he did that made you laugh." He looked at her. "What? James, tell me something he did that was funny. You've told me the thing that haunts you. Tell me something that made you glad he was yours." A long silence. Oh. Then Ethan said very quietly, "He used to try to get Ranger to learn tricks. Ranger is not a dog that learns tricks. He knows this. He just stares at you. James would spend an hour out there perfectly serious trying to teach him to shake hands, and Ranger would sit there like a judge, and James would come inside furious." He paused. "He said once, 'Papa, that dog is smarter than he pretends. He's just too proud to show it.'" Clara looked at Ranger, who was watching them both with amber eyes from under the cot. "He was right," she said. Ethan made the sound that was almost a laugh. "He was right," he said, and his voice had something different in it now, not just the grief, but beneath the grief, warm and real, and still there, the love that grief had been covering, but had not consumed. "She thought you have been alone with the hard part for so long that you forgot the good part was still there too." She did not say that. She just sat with him through the rest of that storm, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching in the firelight, and Ranger eventually crawled out from under the cot and put his head on Ethan's knee, and the storm went on, and neither of them went anywhere. When the storm broke and the world went white and still, and they could finally push the cabin door open against the weight of the new snow, Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the changed landscape. Then he turned back and looked at Clara, who was pulling on her second pair of stockings and preparing to assess the damage, and he said in a voice that was entirely matter-of-fact and entirely not, "I don't want you to go to Harrow Creek." She went still. "Come spring," he said, "when the pass is open. I said I'd take you to Harrow Creek." He paused. "I don't want to do that." She looked at him. "Ethan," she began. "I'm not saying you have to stay," he said. "I'm saying what I want. I have not said what I wanted in a very long time, and I am saying it now. I don't want you to go." The silence was enormous. Outside, the mountain was white and brilliant and remorseless and entirely indifferent to the two people standing in this doorway, and Clara Whitfield, who had been left in the snow to die by the only family she had ever known, looked at the man who had carried her out of it and understood with a certainty that went all the way down to her bones that this was the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. She pulled on her boot. "Then we'd better make sure Pratt doesn't take your land," she said, "because I'm not staying somewhere you don't have a home." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Something crossed his face, fierce and warm, and completely unguarded the look of a man who has just had something he barely allowed himself to want handed back to him intact. "No," he said. "We'd better not let that happen." He reached past her and got his coat, and they went out together into the white world to see what the storm had left them to deal with, and Ranger plunged ahead of them into the new snow with the unambiguous joy of a dog who had decided weeks ago that this was exactly how things should be. The damage from the storm was real, but manageable. A section of the roof overhang on the north side had come down under the snow weight. The woodpile needed reorganizing after the wind scattered the outer stack, and one of the trapline sets closest to the ridge had been buried under a drift deep enough that they had to dig for it. They spent 2 full days on the repairs, working alongside each other with the efficient, wordless coordination they had developed over weeks, each reading what the other needed before it was said, passing tools and bracing timber and making decisions in the compressed shorthand of people who had stopped having to explain themselves to each other. On the evening of the second day, when they came inside, and Clara put coffee on, and Ethan sat down, and Ranger collapsed with theatrical exhaustion across the entire floor in front of the fire. Ethan said, "I got a response from Holt." She turned around. He was holding a folded letter. She hadn't seen it. He must have found it at the relay marker on the south ridge, which he had checked that morning while she was working the line. "When did that come?" she said. "This morning. I didn't want to say until we finished the roof." She crossed the room and sat down across from him. "What does it say?" He unfolded it and read it aloud. Holt's response was short and careful. The letter of a man who understood the stakes and was choosing his words accordingly. The original Patterson deed was on file in Denver, as Clara had surmised. The record showed a legitimate transfer of title and a recorded sale price. However, and this was the part that made Ethan's voice go flat, and even as he read it, Pratt's organization had already submitted a competing claim, filed 3 weeks ago before Ethan's letter had arrived. The competing claim alleged that Patterson's original title had been fraudulently obtained from a prior homesteader, which would make every subsequent transfer invalid. Holt had done what he could. He had flagged Ethan's correspondence and attached it to the file. But the competing claim was now in the system, and a hearing had been scheduled. "When?" Clara said. Ethan looked at the letter. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She absorbed that. 6 weeks to get to Denver, which was not impossible if the passes cooperated, and to appear before whatever court Pratt had arranged this hearing in front of, with whatever documentation they could gather, against whatever lawyers Pratt had ready and waiting. "The other families," she said. "The 4 that Pratt displaced. You need to contact them. Written testimony, ideally statements, describing the same pattern of competing claim, same organization name, same tactics." She was already thinking through it. If there's a pattern of fraudulent filings that changes what this is, it becomes conspiracy rather than a single disputed claim, and that is a different animal entirely in a territorial court. Ethan looked at her. "I don't know where all of them settled," he said. "Holt might, or the surveyor's office. I wrote to Aldous. We don't know if that letter reached him, but if it did, his office would have records of affected parcels." She paused. "There are also the settlements. Word travels. We need to talk to people." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know I'm not talking to people is not what I do." "I know," she said, "but I can. If you point me toward the nearest settlement with regular traffic, I can go." She paused. "Or we can both go." He looked at the letter. He looked at the fire. He set the letter down on the table with a deliberate care that said he had made a decision. "We both go," he said. "I'll not send you into a settlement alone to fight my fight." "It's not only your fight," she said. "It stopped being only your fight when he rode up here with 4 riders and a lawyer, and looked at me like furniture." Something moved in Ethan's expression, quick and hot, and gone before it fully arrived. "No," he said. "I reckon it did." They left for Sutter's Crossing 3 days later, when the trail had hardened enough to hold the horse. Ethan had one horse, a dark-coated animal named Gideon, who was old enough to be opinionated about winter travel, but experienced enough to be reliable in it. Clara rode behind Ethan, and Ranger ran ahead of them, and the mountain was white and silent all around them, and Clara held on with her hands at Ethan's sides, and thought about 6 weeks and what could be done in 6 weeks if you were not too proud, or too private, or too afraid to ask for help. Sutter's Crossing was not much a trading post, a blacksmith, a saloon that also served as a gathering place, and a collection of homesteads scattered in the valley below the ridge. It had been here longer than most places in this part of the territory, which meant it had history and people who had seen things come and go and had opinions about both. The man behind the counter at the trading post was named Aldous Webb, and he had the particular bearing of a man who had served as the unofficial center of local information for long enough that he wore it like a second coat. He looked at Ethan with a measuring attention when they came in, and at Clara with something that was, she noted, not dismissive but curious. "Callahan," he said, "don't see you down here much." "I need information," Ethan said. "Most people who come in want supplies," Webb said. "You want information, you'll need to talk to me properly. Who's this?" "Clara Whitfield," she said before Ethan could answer. "We have a land matter, and we believe it affects more than just us. We're looking for anyone who's had dealings with a man named Gerald Pratt or the Denver Land Trust." Webb's face did something immediate and specific at the name. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Webb knew 4 names, 3 that matched the families Ethan had mentioned, and a 4th that was new. A widow named Ruth Casper, 62 years old, who had been farming 40 acres in the valley south of Sutter's Crossing, and had been served with a competing claim document the previous October. She had fought it with what savings she had and lost, and had moved in with her son's family in town. "She's still here," Clara said. "Down the road," Webb said. "The yellow house." Clara looked at Ethan. "I'll go," she said. "We'll go," he said. Ruth Casper answered the door with the wariness of a woman who had learned that knocks could mean bad news, and she looked at them both for a long moment before she spoke. "What do you want?" she said. "We want to fight Gerald Pratt," Clara said, "and we think you might want to help us." Something shifted in Ruth Casper's eyes. She was small and angular, and had the compressed energy of a woman who had been angry for months and had not found anywhere to put it. "Come in," she said. They sat at Ruth Casper's table for 2 hours. She told them everything: the initial contact from Pratt's representative, the documents that arrived shortly after the lawyer she'd tried to engage, who had told her the cost of fighting it would exceed the value of the land the day she'd signed over her 40 acres and packed her things. "He told me," she said, her voice flat and controlled, "that it would be better for everyone if I just accepted the settlement. That I was an old woman alone, and didn't I want peace in my final years?" She looked at her hands. "I have been farming that land since my husband died in '68. 20 years. He told me I should want peace." "Would you give written testimony?" Clara said. "Describing exactly what happened, the organization name, the timeline, the tactics used." "I'd give more than that," Ruth said. "I'd go to Denver myself if it would put that man in front of a judge." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over the older woman's hand. "It might come to that," she said. "If it does, I'll make sure you have a way to get there." Ruth Casper looked at her. She looked at Ethan. She looked back at Clara with an expression that was not quite hope yet, but was the specific look of a person in whom hope has been recently reactivated against their own expectations. "Who are you?" she said, not unkindly. "You didn't come off this mountain together. I can tell that. You've got a settled somewhere look about you, but it ain't this mountain." Clara met her eyes. "I got left in the snow in January," she said. "He found me, and now this is my mountain too." Ruth Casper looked at them both for another long moment. Then she got up and got her pen. They left Sutter's Crossing 3 hours later with written testimony from Ruth Casper, a name and direction toward a second affected family in a settlement called Pine Fork, and Webb's agreement to put out word through his trading network about anyone else who'd had dealings with the Denver Land Trust. Webb was a man who understood that Pratt's activities were bad for the whole territory's stability, and bad for stability was bad for trade, and bad for trade was the one argument that moved Webb faster than any other. On the trail back up the mountain in the last cold hour before the light went. Ethan said, "You did that." "We did that," she said. "Ruth Casper would not have opened that door for me alone. I would have knocked and she would have said no, and I would have accepted it because I don't push on closed doors." He paused. "You do." "I've had to," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The way you talked to her," he said. "The way you didn't make her feel helped. You made her feel capable, like she was doing something instead of having something done for her." He paused. "That's a skill." "It's not a skill," Clara said. "It's just what I would have wanted someone to say to me." He didn't say anything to that. He just shifted the reins slightly, and the horse moved, and the mountain went cold around them. And Clara held on, and thought about Ruth Casper's pen moving across paper, and thought that sometimes the worst things that happened to you left you with exactly the tools you needed to fight back. They were halfway up the ridge trail when Gideon shied. The horse went sideways hard. Not panicked, but startled the controlled spook of an experienced animal responding to something it had heard before its rider did. Ethan had him settled in 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds were enough for Clara to look at the tree line and see what Gideon had heard. 2 riders, sitting still in the trees, watching the trail. She recognized one of them. The bigger of Pratt's unnamed men, the one who had shifted in his saddle during their second confrontation. He was watching them with a flat attention that was specifically designed to be seen. This was not an accidental encounter. This was a message. "We know where you go. We know when you leave. We know the trail you take back." "I see them," Ethan said quietly. "Don't stop," she said, equally quiet. "Don't look. Keep moving." "I know," he said. "Keep your hand on the knife." She already had it there. They rode past the tree line without looking again, and the riders did not follow. And when they got above the tree line and onto the open ridge where nothing could approach unseen, Ethan let out a slow breath. "He's escalating," Clara said. "Yes. He knows about Sutter's Crossing. He has someone there. Or someone on the trail, or both." He looked straight ahead. "He wants us to know he's watching. Why? If he has the legal filing already in place, why bother with the intimidation?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Because the filing alone won't be enough," he said. "If we show up in Denver with testimony and a documented pattern, the hearing doesn't go his way. He needs us not to show up." He paused. "Or he needs us rattled enough that we go in looking like people who don't know what they're doing." "We're not rattled," she said. "I know that. He doesn't know that yet." She thought about that. She thought about the rider in the tree line sitting still and deliberate, making sure they saw him. She thought about Pratt in his good coat, with his manufactured smile, calculating odds. "He doesn't know what we've collected," she said. "No. He thinks we're isolated. He thinks we're one man with a cabin and a disputed deed and no resources." She paused. "He hasn't recalculated for the fact that you're not alone anymore." Ethan turned and looked at her over his shoulder just briefly, just for a moment. "No," he said. "He hasn't." The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of hard. The kind that comes not from physical labor or cold or danger, but from the grinding, sustained effort of building a case against a man with more money and more connections and more practice at this particular kind of combat than they had. Clara wrote letters every evening by firelight. She organized the testimony they'd collected Ruth Casper's, and 2 more they gathered over a second trip to Pine Fork, where a farmer named Ezra Boone had lost 80 acres the previous spring and kept the original claim documents Pratt's man had served him, which was more than they had hoped for. She wrote to the territorial governor's office. She did not expect a response before the hearing, but she sent it because a letter in the file, even an unresponded one, created a record. She wrote to a newspaper in Denver whose name she found in one of Ethan's 3-year-old supply wrapping papers. A long letter describing a pattern of land fraud and the families displaced by it, with names and dates and the specific organizational name of Pratt's Trust. She did not know if it would be published. She sent it because Pratt was a man who operated in darkness, and she intended to remove as much of the darkness as she could reach. Ethan watched her work and said very little, and did what she asked, signing where she told him to sign, adding detail where she flagged gaps, writing back to Sutter's Crossing twice more to follow leads that Webb had passed along. He was not a man who worked through paperwork naturally, and there were evenings where she could feel him wanting to do something physical with his frustration, wanting to take it outside where it could be resolved with his hands in the direct way the mountain had taught him to solve problems. She understood that. She let him go cut wood on those evenings, and when he came back she had a fresh cup of coffee waiting and the next document laid out, and he sat down and got back to it. "You're better at this than I am," he said one evening. "Different skill," she said. "Not better." "It is better. The letter's the way you build the argument. There's a logic to it I can see, but couldn't build myself." She looked up from the letter she was drafting. "You build a case for exactly where to place every set on a 12-mile trapline based on animal behavior, wind patterns, and terrain," she said. "You just do it with your hands instead of with a pen. It's the same kind of thinking." He considered that. "Huh," he said. "Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm just—" He paused. "I'm not used to someone explaining me to myself." "Is that bad?" He looked at her directly. The full, steady look she had come to understand was him being completely present. No buffer, no filter. "No," he said. "It's the opposite of bad." It was on a Friday night 10 days before the scheduled hearing that the third and most serious thing happened. Clara woke at 2 in the morning with Ranger growling. Not the low social growl he used when something moved in the dark outside that was probably just an animal. The deep, chest-level growl that she had learned over the past weeks of living with this dog meant something requiring a human decision. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Ethan was already up. He had the rifle. "How many?" she said. "Don't know. Ranger's tracking something on the north side." She got the knife and moved to the window on the south side, the side away from where Ranger was pointing, and looked out. 2 men on foot moving toward the supply shed. "South side," she said quietly. 2 men. The shed. Ethan crossed the room in 4 steps and looked. She watched his jaw set. "They're not after us," he said. "They're after the pelts. A season's worth of pelts in that shed. Not just income leverage. They needed resources for the Denver hearing, and the pelts were the primary tradable asset available to them. Without those pelts, the trip to Denver became significantly harder. Pratt, she thought. Not Pratt himself. Pratt would not dirty his hands this way. But Pratt's direction. "He wants to take the money out of it," she said. "If we can't afford to get to Denver—" "I know," Ethan said. He looked at the shed. He looked at her. "I'm going out. I'm coming with you. Clara." "Ethan." She held his gaze. 2 men, 2 of us. You are not leaving me in here while you go out there alone." A beat. His eyes moved over her face. She watched him weigh it and watched him reach the only conclusion that the evidence supported. "Stay on my left," he said. "Don't get ahead of me. If this goes wrong, you get back inside and you bar the door. If it goes wrong, I don't leave you out there. Clara." "We can argue about it after," she said. "Right now, those men are 20 feet from the shed." He looked at her for 1 more second. Then he opened the cabin door. They went out into the cold dark together. Ethan moved fast and without sound. She had learned watching him that large men who had spent years in the wilderness often moved with exactly this quality. The deliberate silence of someone who understood that sound was information, and information was power. She moved as quietly as she could behind and to his left, and Ranger ghosted ahead of them both, a dark shape that was more sensed than seen. One of the men at the shed heard them at the last moment. He turned. Ethan put himself between Clara and the 2 men and raised the rifle. "I'd stop right there," he said. His voice in the dark had a quality she had not heard before, flat and final, and entirely without heat, the voice of a man who was not performing anything. "Both of you." They stopped. The one who had turned was younger than she'd expected, 25 at most, with the look of a man who had taken this job without fully thinking through what the job might involve. He was holding the latch of the shed door, and he had gone very still. The second man was older. He had the harder look of someone who had done this kind of work before. "You want to think about what comes next," Ethan said, "and think about it fast, because I've got you for trespass and attempted theft, and I am not a patient man at 2 a.m. The older man said with a calculated calm, "We're not carrying anything. You can't prove intent." "I can prove you're on my land in the dark with your hand on my shed door," Ethan said. "In Colorado territory, that's enough for a magistrate." He paused. "Or I could just deal with this without the magistrate, which I'd prefer." Something in how he said that last part, quiet and level and entirely credible, made the older man recalculate visibly. "Pratt send you," Clara said. Both men looked at her. She had moved up to stand beside Ethan, now the knife in her hand. The younger man's eyes went from the knife to her face and back to Ethan's rifle, and she could see the math he was doing. She spoke directly to him. "You look like a man who needs work," she said. "Not like a man who signed up to take the fall for someone else's lawsuit. Pratt won't be standing next to you in front of a magistrate. That'll just be you." She kept her voice even and matter-of-fact. "But if you tell me what he asked you to do, and when he asked you, you walk away from here tonight, and we don't file anything with anyone." The older man said, "Don't say a word." The younger man said, "He paid us $40 to burn the shed." The silence after that was total. Clara felt Ethan go very still beside her. Not just take the pelts. Burn it. $40 to burn a winter's worth of work and resources and take out the foundation of their ability to fight the hearing. It was efficient and brutal, and told her exactly what kind of man Gerald Pratt was, underneath the good coat and the manufactured charm. "Walk away," Ethan said to the older man. His voice had gone to the flat register again, colder. "Right now. And tell whoever sent you that this didn't happen, because if he sends anyone else up here before that hearing, the next conversation doesn't end with you walking away." The older man looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then he turned and walked, and the younger one followed, and Ranger tracked them with his eyes until the dark took them. They stood there in the cold for a moment. "Burn it," Ethan said quietly to nobody in particular. He was going to burn it. Clara put the knife away. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not, but her hands were. "We have a witness," she said. "The younger man told us directly that Pratt paid for it. That's attempted arson by proxy. That is a criminal matter, not a civil one." She looked at Ethan. "If we get that testimony in front of the Denver court alongside everything else, it changes the entire hearing," he said. "It changes Pratt's position completely. He's not a legitimate land claimant with a disputed deed. He's a man who paid someone $40 to destroy evidence." She paused. "We need to get to Denver a day early. We need to file that testimony separately through a criminal proceeding before the civil hearing." Ethan looked at her. In the dark, with the cold air around them, and the supply shed intact at their backs, and the mountain white and vast and silent above. He looked at her with an expression she had been watching evolve over 8 weeks from that first practical assessment. "You're alive. That's enough. Through every incremental revision, through the fire and the storm and the letters and the writers in the tree line to this. To this particular look right now, which was not any of those earlier things." "Clara Whitfield," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something." She waited. "I have been trying," he said, "for about 6 weeks to talk myself out of saying this, because I am a man who has lived on a mountain alone for 6 years, and I am not sure I know how to do this correctly." She looked at him. "Say it anyway," she said. He took his hat off. He held it in both hands. He looked at her with the full, direct, undiluted steadiness that was the most purely Ethan thing about him. "I don't want a housekeeper," he said. "I don't want a helper, and I don't want someone to manage the logistics of my life. Though you are the best I've ever seen at that, and it has made everything better. I want—" He stopped. He started again. You walked out of that snow, and you have been fighting every single day since. For yourself, and then for me, and then for Ruth Casper and Ezra Boone and everybody else Pratt has walked over. And you didn't do any of it because you needed to. You did it because it was right, and because you are who you are. He paused. I don't want to drive you to Harrow Creek in the spring. I want you to stay. Not as an arrangement, as my wife. The cold was the same. The mountain was the same. Ranger was sitting in the snow between them, with his head tilted at a precise angle that suggested he had been waiting for this specific development for some time, and was experiencing satisfaction about its arrival. Clara looked at Ethan Callahan at the hat in his hands, and the steadiness in his eyes, and the 6 years of solitude and grief and self-sufficiency that were written in the lines of him, all of it offered, now openly without condition. She thought about her father's wagon disappearing into the snow. She thought about all the versions of herself she had been told she was too much, too heavy, too slow a burden, a problem. Something to be managed and minimized and ultimately discarded. She thought about the knife in her hand on that slope, and Ethan coming out of the trees, and the words, "You're alive, that's enough." She thought about how much her life had changed in 8 weeks, because one man had looked at her and seen past everything the world had told her. She was the actual person who was there. Yes, she said. Just that. Clean and certain, and without qualification. His breath came out. She realized he had been holding it. Yes, he said. Ethan, yes. He put his hat back on. He reached out and took her hand. His large, rough hand around her cold fingers, and held it with a care that said everything he had not yet found words for. They stood there together in front of the intact supply shed in the 2 a.m. dark, and the mountain went on in every direction, enormous and cold and entirely uninterested in human arrangements, and neither of them was alone in it anymore. Ranger lay down in the snow between their feet, and put his head on his paws and closed his eyes with the absolute serenity of a dog whose work here was done. Denver in 5 days, Clara said after a moment. Denver in 5 days, he agreed. She squeezed his hand. We should go inside, she said. I need to draft the criminal complaint before I sleep. He looked at her. You are going to draft a legal complaint right now. I need to have it ready. The language matters. She paused. I'll have coffee. He shook his head, but he was smiling, the real one, the full one, the one that rearranged his face entirely, and he held her hand all the way back to the cabin door. She drafted the criminal complaint by firelight while Ethan sat across from her and drank coffee and read it as she wrote, stopping her twice to add details. She had not known the specific date of Pratt's second visit, the exact words the older man had used when he told them they couldn't prove intent, the direction the 2 men had come from, which Ethan had tracked by sound, and which mattered because it indicated they had come up the South Trail, the same trail that passed within half a mile of where Pratt's riders had sat watching in the tree line 2 weeks prior. Pattern. Clara kept thinking. Everything Pratt did was pattern. And pattern was the thing that turned a single disputed land claim into something a court could not ignore. She finished the complaint at 4 a.m. and read it back to Ethan in full. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. You should have been a lawyer, he said. Women don't get to be lawyers, she said. I know, I'm saying you should have been. She looked at the document in her hands. I had to learn the next best thing, how to think like one when I needed to without having the title. She set it down. It'll do. It may not be perfect, but it will put what happened on record in a criminal context before we walk into that civil hearing, and that changes the conversation. Yes, it does, he said. She looked at him across the fire. He looked tired, a good tired, the kind that came from something having been resolved rather than from something ongoing and unfinished. He had the look of a man who had been carrying weight alone for a very long time, and had recently discovered that distributed weight was fundamentally different from weight carried alone, and was still slightly disbelieving that the distribution was real and would continue to be real. She understood that feeling precisely. Sleep, she said. We leave in 5 days, and there's still the north fence and the line to settle before we go." "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. "For tonight. Not just the complaint. For coming out of the cabin with me. For being there." She held his gaze. "I told you," she said. "I'm not anyone. I'm yours." He breathed out. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You are." She went to the cot. She was asleep in minutes. The 5 days before Denver moved with the compressed intensity of days that have too much in them. They worked the north fence, set the trap line on the slow trap rotation that would let it run 2 weeks without daily checking arranged with Webb at Sutter's Crossing, to have someone keep eyes on the cabin and the shed in their absence, and packed what they needed for 6 days of travel, including every document, every letter, every piece of written testimony they had gathered over the past weeks. Clara organized it all into a leather satchel she had found in Ethan's storage and oiled until it was properly weatherproof. She cataloged the contents on a separate sheet of paper and kept that sheet inside her coat separate from the satchel, because she was a woman who had learned that you did not keep your only record of what you had in the same place as the things themselves. Ruth Casper met them at the bottom of the mountain trail on the 3rd morning. She was on a horse that belonged to her son, and she had a small bag tied to the saddle, and an expression that said she had made a decision and was not entertaining challenges to it. "I told you I'd go to Denver if it came to it," she said when Ethan looked at her. "It's come to it." Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ruth. "Can you keep that pace for 4 days?" she said. "I kept pace with 3 kids and a farm for 30 years, Ruth said. "I reckon I can manage a horse trail." Ezra Boone was waiting at Pine Fork, also mounted, also packed with the flat, determined look of a man who had spent 6 months being angry about something and had finally found a direction to point it. "Heard you were going," he said to Ethan. "Figured my testimony carried more weight in person than on paper." Ethan looked at the small group assembled on the Pine Fork trail himself. Clara, Ruth Casper, Ezra Boone, and Clara watched something move across his face that she recognized as the specific surprise of a man who had stopped expecting the world to show up and was encountering it showing up anyway. "All right," he said. "Denver." They rode south. The 4 days were hard, travel cold and long, but they had good weather for it, and the trails had compacted enough after the storm to be manageable. They camped 2 nights. And on those nights, Ruth Casper turned out to be a camp cook of considerable skill, which she deployed with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people in difficult conditions for most of her life. Ezra Boone, who had initially struck Clara as taciturn to the point of impenetrability, turned out to have a dry, sardonic wit that emerged after the first evening's fire and grew more pronounced as they went south. And by the second night, the 4 of them were talking with the easy rhythm of people who have been through something together. Clara noticed Ethan in those nights particularly. He talked more than she had ever seen him talk, not freely, not the way a naturally social man talked, but steadily responding to Ezra's questions about the trapline, with the precise technical interest of a man who had accumulated a great deal of knowledge and rarely had occasion to share it. Ruth asked him about the cabin, and he described it with the quiet pride of someone who had built something with their own hands and knew exactly how well they had built it. He laughed twice at Ezra's stories, and both times Clara felt it as a small private victory, like watching something locked work its way gradually back to open. On the 4th morning, they rode into Denver. Clara had not been in a city of any size since Missouri, and Denver was not Missouri. It was louder and faster and more concentrated, with the particular energy of a place that was still deciding what it was going to be. She noticed all of it with the systematic attention she brought to everything, cataloging and filing the location of the Hall of Records, the territorial courthouse 3 blocks north, the newspaper offices she had written to, whose name was on a sign above a door on the main thoroughfare. She pulled Ethan's sleeve when they passed the newspaper office. "Stop here," she said. He looked at the sign. He looked at her. "Clara. If my letter got here and someone read it, there may be a reporter who knows this story already. A reporter who knows this story and knows we're here for the hearing is worth more than a letter in a file." She held his eyes. Public attention is the one thing Pratt's lawyers cannot file a competing claim against. He considered it for exactly 4 seconds. "Go," he said. "I'll take Ruth and Ezra to the rooming house and meet you at the Hall of Records in an hour." She went. The newspaper office smelled like ink and coal smoke, and the specific urgency of places where information was the primary product. A young man at the front desk looked up when she came in, took in her appearance with the standard rapid assessment, and was clearly preparing a polite dismissal when she said, "My name is Clara Whitfield. I wrote to this paper 6 weeks ago about Gerald Pratt and the Denver Land Trust. I am here for the hearing tomorrow, and I have documentary evidence of a pattern of land fraud affecting at least 5 families in Colorado Territory, plus a criminal complaint for attempted arson filed this morning." The young man stopped preparing the dismissal. "Hold on," he said. He went through a door. He came back with an older man whose sleeves were rolled up and who had the look of someone who had been writing under deadline pressure for 20 years and had made a comprehensive peace with it. "Miss Whitfield," the older man said. He was already holding her letter. "I'm Henderson, editor. Sit down." She sat down. She talked for 45 minutes. Henderson took notes with the focused efficiency of a man who recognized a real story when it was in his office. He asked precise questions. She answered them precisely. She showed him the organized contents of the satchel, not the originals, because she was not leaving the originals with anyone, but she let him read them and copy what he needed. When she was done, he looked at his notes. "The hearing is tomorrow," he said, 9 in the morning, Territorial Courthouse. "I'll have a man there," he said, "and I'll run something in the afternoon edition today." She stood up. She offered her hand. He shook it with the brisk respect of a man who had revised his expectations upward and was not embarrassed to show it. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "are you from Denver?" "I'm from a mountain about 4 days north," she said, "but I'm from here today." She found the others at the Hall of Records, where a clerk named Holt had met them with the wariness of a man who owed a favor and was preparing to pay it. Holt was small and precise with careful eyes, and he looked at Clara when Ethan introduced her, with the measuring attention of someone assessing whether the person in front of him was actually as competent as the person who had vouched for them had implied. She pulled out the criminal complaint, the documented pattern summary, and the 3 letters she had written to various offices and their available responses, and she laid them on the counter in order. Holt looked at the documents. He looked at Clara. He looked at Ethan. "She put this together," he said. "She put everything together," Ethan said. "I provided the facts. She built the case." Holt picked up the pattern summary and read it in silence. Clara watched his face. It was a controlled face, the face of a man who had seen many filings and many cases, and had learned not to register his reactions to any of them. But she saw something shift in it as he got to the 3rd page. "This is the 4th time I've seen this organization's name in 6 months, he said to nobody in particular. "I know," Clara said. "That's why we filed centrally rather than locally." He looked up at her. "The criminal complaint needs to go to the sheriff's office," he said. "But I can walk it there myself this afternoon and make sure it's in front of the right person before that hearing tomorrow." "We'd appreciate that," Clara said. "The pattern documentation." He paused. "If I attach this to the civil file before the hearing, it changes the context of the proceeding significantly." "Yes," she said. "That's the idea." He looked at her for another moment. Then he began making his own notes with the brisk efficiency of a man who had decided the favor he owed was going to be paid in full. That night in the rooming house, Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and went through the satchel one final time, checking, ordering, making sure every document was where she could put her hand on it in the dark if she needed to. It was a habit, the same habit as the striker in her coat pocket, the knife, the folded oilcloth. The practice of a woman who had learned not to count on circumstances staying favorable. Ethan knocked on the door between their rooms. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat on the chair by the window. He looked at the organized documents on the bed and at her face and said, You're not sleeping. I will. Clara. She looked at him. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, I need you to know that none of this, none of what we've built, none of what we have depends on how that hearing goes. She looked at her hands. The cabin is yours, she said. You've been there 6 years. That should not be up for, I know. But if it were, he paused. If the worst happened and we lost the land, I want you to know that what I have is not the cabin. What I have is what's been true since about the 6th week of this winter. He looked at her directly. You understand what I'm saying? She understood. I know, she said. I feel the same. She looked at the satchel. But I don't intend to lose. Something fierce and warm moved through his expression. No, he said. I don't reckon you do. He got up. He squeezed her shoulder once firm and steady, the touch of a man who meant it, and went back to his room. She organized the satchel one last time, and then she slept. The territorial courthouse in the morning had the cold institutional gravity of a place where decisions were made that lasted. Clara walked in with Ethan on one side and Ruth Casper on the other, and Ezra Boone behind them, and the satchel on her arm and the criminal complaint receipt in her inside coat pocket, and she did not look at anything except where she was going. Pratt was already there. He was at the plaintiff's table with 2 lawyers, real ones, city lawyers with pressed coats and practiced expressions, and the specific confidence of men who worked rooms like this regularly and knew all the exits. He looked at Ethan when they came in with the smooth, calculated assessment of a man updating his odds. Then he looked at Clara, then at Ruth Casper, then at Ezra Boone. She watched his odds recalculate. Then she watched him see the organized satchel on her arm, and she watched him look at the door through which 10 minutes later a young man with a notebook came in and took a seat in the gallery, and she watched Pratt lean to the nearer of his 2 lawyers and say something brief and quiet that made the lawyer look at Clara with new attention. Good, she thought. Let him recalculate. The judge was a man named Harlan Foss, 60 years old, with the weathered patience of someone who had been hearing disputes about land and money and rights for long enough that very little surprised him. He came in, sat down, looked at both tables, looked at the gallery and said, Before we proceed, I'm advised there is a criminal complaint filed this morning in connection with this matter. Counselor, Pratt's lead lawyer stood. Your Honor, the complaint is unsubstantiated and irrelevant to the civil. I didn't ask for your opinion on it, Foss said without heat. I asked for a summary. He looked at Clara's side of the table. Who filed? Clara stood. She had not planned to speak first. Ethan's claim was the subject of the hearing, and she had prepared him to speak, had gone through it with him twice the night before. But Holt had put her name on the criminal complaint at her instruction because she had been present for the incident, and Ethan had been present, but she was the one who had spoken to the younger man and received the confession, and her name was on more of the supporting documents than his was. Clara Whitfield, she said. I filed the complaint on behalf of myself and Mr. Ethan Callahan, whose property was the subject of the attempted arson. Foss looked at her. The same measuring look she had gotten from Holt, from Henderson, from Ruth Casper when they'd first knocked on her door. You prepared the complaint yourself, he said. Yes, Your Honor. And the supporting documentation? Yes, Your Honor. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at her. Sit down, Miss Whitfield, he said. There was something different in his voice now, a quality of attention she recognized as respect precise and unornamented, the kind that did not come with performance attached. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Pratt's lawyers presented their case with the smooth professional efficiency of men who had run this play before the argument about Patterson's title, The Chain of Alleged Fraud, reaching back 15 years, the technical territorial charter language that gave their client standing to file. It was constructed well. Clara had to admit that. It would have been convincing in a room where no one had prepared for it. But this room had prepared for it. When Ethan's turn came, she handed him the documents in the order they had agreed on, and he presented each one with the plain, unvarnished directness that was his natural manner, And that was, she had told him, one of his greatest assets in front of a judge who had heard elaborate constructions all day long. The deed record from Holt. The pattern documentation cross-referencing 4 other land trust filings in the same county over 2 years. Ruth Casper's testimony, which Ruth read herself, standing at the front of the room with the compressed anger quietness of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for 6 months. Ezra Boone's testimony, including the original claim documents he had preserved, which Pratt's lawyers had not known about, and which produced at one point a whispered conference between them that Foss let go on for 30 seconds before cutting it off with a tap on his desk. Then Clara presented the criminal complaint and its supporting detail, the 2 men, the admission of payment, the sum, the intended act, and she read it clearly and without inflection, the way you read something when you want the words to carry their own weight without editorial assistance. The gallery had gone very quiet. Henderson's reporter was writing without stopping. Pratt at his table had the look of a man watching the ground shift under his feet and calculating with diminishing confidence whether there was stable ground within reach. Foss asked questions. Good ones, specific ones, the questions of a man who was not performing attention, but actually paying it. He asked Clara 3 questions directly, bypassing both sets of lawyers, and she answered them directly. And at the end of the 3rd answer, Foss looked at her for a moment and then looked at Pratt's lead lawyer and said, "Counselor, I'd like to hear how the criminal complaint for attempted arson squares with your client's claim of legitimate competing interest." Pratt's lead lawyer said they were unrelated matters. Foss said, "I disagree." The hearing ended at noon. Foss did not rule immediately. He took a recess and came back 40 minutes later with the look of a man who had thought carefully and arrived somewhere he was comfortable with. He affirmed Ethan's title. He referred the competing claim to the Territorial Attorney's Office for investigation of the larger pattern. He issued a ruling on the criminal complaint that put Pratt on formal notice that further interference with Callahan property would result in arrest. He did not send Pratt to jail that day, but he made it very clear in the specific, careful language of a judge who knew how to make a thing clear without overstepping that Gerald Pratt's business model in Colorado Territory had become significantly more complicated. Pratt left without speaking. His lawyers left with him. The older of the 2 glanced at Clara on the way out with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between professional acknowledgement and the specific displeasure of someone who has underestimated an opponent and knows it. Ruth Casper grabbed Clara's hands the moment Foss left the bench. "Lord in heaven," Ruth said. Her eyes were bright. "That man's face when Foss said he was referring the pattern to the attorney. Did you see it?" "I saw it," Clara said. "I have been waiting to see that face for 6 months." Ruth squeezed her hands hard. "You did that. You built all of that." "We built it," Clara said. "Don't be modest. I've been modest my whole life, and it hasn't gotten me a thing." Ruth looked at her fiercely. "You built it. Own it." Clara looked at her. She thought about her stepmother's voice telling her what she was. She thought about all the diminishments, large and small, that she had carried so long. She had started to think they were simply part of the weight of being herself. She looked at Ruth Casper's hands holding hers, and at Ezra Boone behind Ruth with a grin that was the first uncomplicated expression she had seen on his face, and at Ethan beside her, watching her with the particular steady look that she now understood was the look of a man who was no longer surprised by anything she did, but had not stopped being moved by it. "All right," she said. "I built it." Ruth laughed. It was a wonderful laugh, surprised and full the laugh of a woman rediscovering what it felt like. Ethan put his hand on the small of Clara's back. Not possessive, just present. The simple physical fact of him being there behind her with her. She leaned into it just slightly. They left the courthouse into the cold Denver noon, the 4 of them together, and Ezra Boone said he thought they deserved the best meal Denver had to offer, and Ruth said she thought that was the first sensible thing she had heard in 3 days of travel, and Ethan looked at Clara, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the looking didn't already say better. Henderson ran the story the next day. Clara read it at breakfast at the rooming house, a full column on the front page of the inside section, factual and precise, and carrying exactly the quality she had been hoping for, the tone of a story about something that mattered beyond the specific case. He had gotten the pattern right. He had named the 5 families and their losses. He had quoted Ruth Casper, which Clara thought was exactly right because Ruth Casper quoted better than anyone. He had also described Clara herself in one line near the end of the piece as Miss Whitfield, formerly of Missouri, whose legal preparation is reported to have impressed the court and whose testimony regarding an attempted arson was central to the referral for criminal investigation. She folded the paper and put it in the satchel. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "For the record," she said. He nodded once without comment in the way of a man who understood why you kept a record of things. They started north the next morning. Ruth rode with them as far as Sutter's Crossing, and when they parted at the bottom of Ruth's son's road, the older woman pulled Clara into a hug that was brief and fierce, and said without saying anything, the things that did not need to be said. Ezra shook Ethan's hand at Pine Fork and said, "You need anything, you know where I am." And Ethan said he did, and both of them meant it. And then it was just the 2 of them on the trail north, and Gideon's steady pace, and Ranger running the ridgeline ahead of them in the thin February sun. Spring came the way it always came to the high country slowly, and then all at once the snow receding in stages, the trails opening, the particular smell of thawed earth arriving like a door opening onto something that had been closed all winter. The cabin changed with it. Clara put a garden in on the south-facing slope beside the shed, working the ground with the methodical patience of someone who understood that things that lasted required careful preparation. Ethan built her a proper cold storage space off the back of the cabin, fitted with shelves he made himself, and that were straight and level in a way that told her how much care he had put into them. They married in May, when the passes had opened fully, and travel was possible at Sutter's Crossing, in front of Aldous Webb and his wife and Ruth Casper and Ezra Boone, who had made the trip up because he said he wasn't going to miss it. The ceremony was short, and the judge who performed it was a circuit rider named Pollard, who was pleased to have a reason to stay in Sutter's Crossing an extra day, and ate 3 portions of the wedding supper that Ruth Casper organized with the focused efficiency she brought to all things. Ethan said his vows, looking at Clara with the same unfiltered directness he brought to everything that mattered, and Clara said hers, looking back at him the same way. And when Pollard said they were married, Ruth Casper made a sound that was technically not crying, and then cried. On the trail back up the mountain that evening in the long May light, Clara rode behind Ethan with her arms around his waist and her chin on his shoulder, and the world green and gold and enormous around them. And she thought about what she would have said 8 months ago if someone had told her this was where January was going to lead her. She thought she would not have believed it. She thought that was the thing about surviving something you couldn't see from inside, the worst part of it, the particular shape of what was on the other side. You could only keep moving, keep counting steps, keep the knife where you could reach it. She had done all of those things, and the mountain had given her this. In the summer, a letter came. It was addressed to Clara Callahan, care of Sutter's Crossing. And when Webb sent it up with his supply runner, Clara held it for a long moment before she opened it. The handwriting on the front was her father's. She recognized it without wanting to, the way you recognize the handwriting of people who marked your life even when you would prefer the marking had not happened. She opened it. Thomas Whitfield had heard through some chain of connection she did not bother to trace that she was alive. He had heard she was married. He wrote in the careful apologetic style of a man who had been composing this letter in his head for a long time and was not sure any of it was adequate. He said that Margaret was gone left. He said the spring after they'd arrived at Cedar Falls gone with a man who'd been passing through. He said he thought about Clara every day. He said he was sorry. He said the word 3 times in different constructions, as if repetition could do what one clean statement could not. He asked if she would write back. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at the garden through the window and thought about what her father had done, and what it had cost her, and what it had led to, and what she thought about all of it now from this particular distance. Ethan came in from the trapline at noon and saw the letter on the table and looked at her. "My father," she said. He sat down. He didn't say anything. He waited the way he waited for everything with the patient present attention of a man who understood that some things required room. She told him what it said. He was quiet for a moment after. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the letter. She thought about the child she had been, who had believed her father would protect her. She thought about the woman who had walked into the snow with a small axe and trusted the people who were supposed to love her. She thought about the slope where she had gone down, and the counting 1, 2, and the knife. She thought about the fact that she had survived her father's choice. She had survived it, and come through it, and built something on the other side of it that was more than she had ever had when she was under his roof. She was not the same woman he had chosen to leave in the snow. She was not smaller than that woman. She was not harder, or colder, or more diminished. She was, she thought, simply herself. Finally and completely, and without apology, herself. "I'll write back," she said. "Not today, when I'm ready." Ethan nodded. "But not to forgive him," she said. "I'll write because I'm not going to carry it anymore. Because what he did belongs to him, not me. I put it down when I picked up that firewood and walked back out of the trees." She paused. "I'm not picking it back up." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You're not." She folded the letter and put it in the cedar box. Not Ethan's cedar box. Her own one he had made her in February from wood. He'd cut himself fitted with a brass latch that matched his because she had told him once in passing that she liked the look of the one on his, and he had remembered. She put the letter in the box and closed the latch and put it on the shelf. Then she went back to what she had been doing before it arrived. The fall was the best they had. The trapline yielded better than any season Ethan could recall. Clara's garden had come in more fully than either of them had expected, given the late start, and she put up enough stores in the cold room to make Ethan say with the understated approval she had come to understand was his highest register that they were well set for winter. Ruth Casper came to visit for 2 weeks in September, which was not something Clara had expected, but which turned out to be exactly what was needed. Ruth and Ethan took to each other with the gruff mutual respect of two people who had survived difficult things independently and recognized that quality in each other. Ruth helped Clara expand the garden plan for the following year, and she and Ethan had a long conversation one evening about the future of the Pratt investigation. The territorial attorney had in fact opened proceedings, and 3 families had already received restitution for their losses, and there was talk that Pratt's organization would be formally dissolved by spring. Ruth had a satisfaction about her that had not been there in January. A certain reclaimed authority in the way she held herself, the look of someone who had stopped waiting for an outcome and was living in one. "You look different," Clara told her. "So do you," Ruth said. Clara thought about that. She thought about January and the woman she had been, then not broken. She had never been broken, but hollowed in a particular way, carrying the accumulated weight of years of being told she was less. She had not known how heavy it was until she had finally over the months since set it down. "I suppose I do," she said. On the last evening before Ruth left, the 3 of them sat by the fire, and Ranger stretched across all available feet, and the night wind moved through the pines outside, and Clara looked around the cabin at the straight shelves Ethan had built at the garden-dried herbs, hanging from the ceiling, in the careful bundles she had tied at the cedar box on the shelf, at the man across the fire from her reading in the low light, with the same contained self-sufficiency that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and she felt something she had no precise word for. Not happiness exactly, something more durable than happiness. The specific deep satisfaction of a life that had been built rather than inherited, earned rather than assumed, chosen and rechosen every day by 2 people who had both learned through loss and difficulty, and the particular education of the mountain that nothing worth having arrived without cost. She had cost her family their comfort with her presence. She had cost herself everything she thought she had when she walked into those trees in January. She had cost herself the idea of herself that she had been given by people who had not seen her clearly. And in place of what she had lost, she had built this. When she was very old, and she thought sometimes about what she would say if anyone asked her what she had learned from the year that had remade her, she thought she would say, "This being left behind is not the same as being lost." The people who walked away from you are not the authority on your worth. The cold that was supposed to end you, sometimes, only strips away what was never truly yours to begin with. She had walked out of that snow, not as the woman her family had discarded, but as the woman she had always been underneath all of it, capable, clear-eyed, stubborn to the bone, and entirely unwilling to stop at two when she had not yet found the ground. She had found the ground. She had built on it. And the mountain which had tried its best to be her ending had become instead the place where she began.